Hello, good morning, everybody. Welcome again to the ALTE First Digital Symposium. My name's Graham Seed. I'm the Secretariat Manager of ALTE, and I'd like to welcome you to our final day here in this very innovative environment. I really hope that you've enjoyed your time over the last few days, but we've still got many sessions to come today. Without any more interruptions from me, I'd like to very much welcome our first plenary speaker of the day today, Professor Barry O'Sullivan from the British Council. So welcome, Barry. It's great to see you. And I will now hand over to you for your plenary presentation, Can Tests Be Fair and Valid? Barry, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm sure everybody can hear me.
Yeah.
The technology has been in and out a little bit like all technologies, but I think the last year and a bit has kind of made us immune to all of that. But I'm very happy to be here, and I'd like to thank ALTE for inviting me to give this plenary talk. I thought I'd like to talk about something that's close to my own heart, has been for quite some time. And I guess I see the role of the plenary speaker is there to ask some questions and set out some positions to make people think. And I'm certainly going to do that today. Not even all of my own team were deliriously pleased with some of the things I had to say in this presentation when we had a run down through it last week or the week before. But I'd like to thank my guys at the British Council in the ARG team for the work that they've put in to help me to get my thoughts in one place as I prepared for this presentation. So the title is Can Tests Be Fair and Valid? Oh God, I have no idea what I'm doing. Yes, here's my abstract, which we will happily ignore. I'm sure you've all read it and studied it in great detail. For those of you who have actually read the title, I guess there will be some pedants among you, and I'll call you pedants because I don't mind saying that. I'm at a safe distance. Who will say, well, you know, there's an obvious answer to that question, isn't there? And when we think about it, when we think about fairness, we have this concept of fairness that tells us that it relates to the treatment of test takers during the test process. In practice, this relates to measurement bias, equitable access to the constructs being measured, and that would be to the test itself as well, I guess, and appropriateness of test score interpretation. So that's a commonly held understanding of what we mean by fairness. When we think of validity, and I'm looking at the ERA, APA, and CME definition now, it's the degree to which evidence and theory support the interpretation or the interpretations of test scores by proposed uses of tests. And in practice, that relates to measurement, construct, and consequence. At least it does in theory. So when we think about it then, the bottom line is test use can be fair, but test cannot. Maybe. Test use can be valid, test cannot. Maybe. So the answer to the question could well be, well, the bottom line is tests can be fair and valid? No. So I could shut up now, give you all 28 minutes of your life back, and we could go and have a cup of coffee and relax for the morning. But of course, you know what I'm like. I'm not going to stop at that. I have lots more to say, and I intend to say it. So we're going to go back and think a little bit more about validity. I'm not going to talk a huge amount about the background to validity. I'm going to have a naked advertisement for a book that Michelin Chalhoub-Deville and I put out just a few months back called Validity, Theoretical Develops and Integrated Arguments. And we'd go right through a long history of validation and validation theory as it basically came out of the USA mostly. But I'd like to think a little bit differently here. The idea behind this was that it would drift out in pieces, but obviously I've lost my animation. But we lose the dramatic effect, but the message is the same. Essentially, what's happened over the years, over the decades, is we began in the late 19th century with a focus on content. Now, that's never really left us. We're still interested in content, and some people get all upset about the fact that we're too interested in content. Some people will argue that approaches such as the one I worked on with Cyril Weir for many years, the socio-cognitive approach, is too focused on the content of the test. Well, you can't create a test without content is my simple answer to that one. And it's a bit of a ridiculous idea to think that we should be ignoring it. In fact, we'll come back to this issue in a little while. That moved on with criticism of that. By the 1920s, people started to think more about criterion. But we had criterion plus content. Of course, the issue then was, well, what criterion do we use? And that became questioned more and more until the 1950s, when particularly Cronbach and Meehl did their work in relation to the testing of abstract concepts in psychology, really. And they introduced this new concept of construct and created an understanding of how construct might be defined. And they defined it in terms of these nomological networks that exist in our brains, linking all of these abstract concepts. And then we would test the abstract contexts from our heads. That, of course, was questioned almost immediately, particularly by the two people who wrote it, who understood it right from the very beginning, really, that the nomological networks in the social sciences essentially don't exist. So the problem with the whole theory that drove all of that very interesting and good work was that it was essentially built on sand, if you think about it. So the nomological network, which still are around, I noticed just a book on validity that came out just a few months back, where we have a diagram, page 91, tells us, yes, nomological networks lie at the center of one particular aspect of validity, even though we've known for 40 years, 50 years that they don't exist. Validity as a unitary concept then was introduced by Messick, which brought all of the ideas together. And really, that idea continues to drive a lot of our thinking. It certainly drives a lot of thinking with regard to the socio-cognitive approach, where we look for evidence from all of these different areas, though that has been superseded these days, as we know, by the argument-based approach of Kane. We'll come back to Kane in a little while, because I think that's a really important place to think about. But before we do that, I want to think about one of the issues that I have, one of my little bugbears. I'm a great believer in the daily rant. Anybody who knows me knows that I regularly have a daily rant. It releases steam. It makes me feel much better. I'm not sure how the listeners feel, but I feel better after. And my daily rant comes back to this idea that I'm of a certain age, and I can remember the 1960s and 70s growing up with the Vietnam War, and we had Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of State, essentially Secretary of War. Now, he had come from Ford, where he was very used to counting things, and he was a logistics man, essentially. And he had this idea that if we count stuff, that's how we decide whether we're winning this war or not, by counting. But of course, then he had to think about, well, what do we count? And essentially, he came to this conclusion that we see here, that Yankelevich in 1972 called the McNamara fallacy. And it's still around, it still exists, this idea of the McNamara fallacy. The first step is to measure what can be easily measured. And that's not a big problem. We all try to do that. The next step it begins to get problematic then when we disregard what we can't easily measure. That means that what we're presenting is artificial and it's misleading. The third step is to presume that what can't be measured easily isn't important. Now, that's blindness. The fourth step is what can't be easily measured really doesn't exist, and that's suicide. That's Yankelevich. I really like that idea. It's something that any language tester needs to keep in their head, because if you think about some of these tests that are out there right now, we begin to drift into these right from the beginning. They only test what can be easily measured. And it's a real problem that we have in language testing. And it's a problem that we'll come back to in a little while. Immediately, in terms of language testing, it means that up to now, we've essentially allowed the whole area of language testing to be driven by measurement. And because of this over-reliance on measurement, we've ignored, or we've failed to recognize the importance of the underlying construct, the actual language. Where is the language? I stood up at a language testing conference, I think it was in Seoul, and I don't remember when that was, but it's 6 or 7 years ago. And I asked that question, where is the language in language testing? And one or two people walked out of the room because they were so upset that I was attacking the measurement principles, I guess. I don't know. They didn't tell me. But this has led to a narrowing of the construct. So you measure what you can easily measure, essentially. And in turn, it's led to construct-agnostic tests and consequence-agnostic tests. So people who really don't care what the consequences are, they just want to put those tests out in the market. So they're commercial entities, essentially. And that's led to test misuse and misinterpretation and an unregulated industry. Now, you could argue, and I know Jamie Dunley, my good friend at work, tells me that he would argue the other way around, that the unregulated industry has led to all of this. Well, it's a moot point, to be honest, because whatever the cause of it, the root cause of it, we are over-reliant on measurement, and we are not. I shouldn't say we are not. I think a lot of people in Europe, I think ALTA has been a very positive influence, for example, in getting people to think closely about what they're actually testing and not just measurement. Measurement is important, but just measurement is not important. So what can we do about it? Well, not surprisingly, I'm suggesting that we look to the now revised social cognitive model. And this version of it comes from the book I pointed to a little bit earlier, Micheline Chalub-Deville and myself, from last year. And essentially, we break it into 3 elements, as you can see. The whole thing is contained in a context of use. Now, you could say that that's a context of development and a context of use. And that's defined by the social and educational context, which tells us what the test purpose is going to be made, what the test purpose will be. So what decisions will be based on performance, and how those decisions will impact the stakeholders in context. We then think of the test itself, which is that colorful box in the middle. The colorful box in the middle then will be driven by development models, and that will be test development models, such as the social cognitive frameworks put forward by Cyril Weir in his 2005 book, or if you prefer, by Miss Levy et al. In their evidence-based design work, which again is a very valuable approach to developing tests, because it gives you the detail that a lot of the other theories fail to give. But it's also driven by a language model, a very clear definition of what language is and how language changes as we move through the levels. That's where we look to models such as the Khalifa and Weir cognitive models of reading, and the more social models, I guess, of reading and of other skills that you find in the CEFR, particularly in the CV version. All of this then feeds into the consequences, and the consequences is all around the stakeholders. Stakeholders are critically important in consequence, because those are the people who are affected by it. In order to deal with them, we argue in our book that we need a theory of action. Well, before that, we'll have a theory of change. This is what we want to do. This is what we want to say. The theory of action then tells us in great detail, this is how we're going to do it. And of course, then we have a communication model. The communication model helps us to get the messages that we need to get back out to the stakeholders. And up to now, because our stakeholder focus was so narrow, essentially academics and lawyers, I guess, in the States particularly, the type of information that we presented to support our test was highly technical and was not meant really to be approachable by regular stakeholders, we call them. And one of our arguments in all of this approach is that we need to change this. So how do we change it? Well, we look again very closely at the revised model, and we see that the context of use and the tests are critical. It's critical in these cases that the target language is defined in terms of the context, and that the measurement model is meaningful to it. So an abstract model or an abstract language definition is unlikely to work within that context. And a very good example of this is to be seen in the work of Professor Masashi Negishi and Professor Yukio Tono in Japan, in Tokyo, with the CEFR-J, where they've localized or contextualized the CEFR, which means that they can now define the language that they want to assess within their own context. So it's a meaningful definition of the language and language progress. In terms of the consequence, unless we set out the goals of the test system prior to the development, we can't hope to respond to stakeholders. So in other words, I have to talk to stakeholders right from the beginning. I have to understand what their needs and what their concerns are so that I can deal with those in a systematic way, in a meaningful way, as I develop my test system. So the integrated argument approach then that we suggest in our book means that we have, instead of the traditional argument, which tends to rely on measurement, we say we need one argument which, okay, will include measurement, but will also include development and language models. And we also need a second argument where we include the elements related to the stakeholders. I almost forgot what I was trying to say. So let's focus for a minute on the traditional. Traditionally, test and test development and validation theory has focused very much on test purpose, but not always purpose in context, and measurement models. And all of the development models that I see out there that are listed there, whatever people say to me, are very measurement based, and we'll point out that now in a moment. The problem with underemphasis or ignoring most of the elements is that the tests don't necessarily do what we think they're doing. Even if we develop them with the best will in the world, they're not doing what we want them to do. Now, probably the man who's been most influential over the last 3 decades, really, in validation theory has been Michael Caine. So let's have a think about what Michael Caine, what his position is. He's telling us essentially here it's notoriously difficult to pin down the interpretation of an observation. It's even more difficult to reach consensus on the appropriate uses of test scores. As a result, it's not been easy to formulate a general methodology for validation. Fair enough. What we have tried to do with the socio-cognitive approach from the beginning, really, was to think about a background, an underlying model, if you like, of validation linked to development, which is development in context. So we're looking at validation in context, I guess, is what we're really saying here. Now, language testing, in terms of other areas of education, I think has edged a lot closer to the underlying constructs than other areas, and I think the socio-cognitive approach has helped. And I've given an example there from the technical report from APTIS version 2.2. There is an earlier one where we give out in great detail the specification, the rationale, the background to all of the decisions that are built into that test development. That really helps because it forces us as test developers to be very clear in our thinking of what we're actually trying to say. Now, you could also argue that Chappell 2008 uses Caine, but actually uses it in quite an interesting way, because actually when you look at the elements of the argument in that book, they're very similar and overlap a lot with the approach that we've taken in our own APTIS work at the British Council, which I think is an interesting way to think about things. Caine's interpretation, that should be general principles there. I'm not going to read through all of this. He's basically telling us that their formulation of construct validity emphasized theoretical constructs, but the general principles introduced in the 55 paper, and these are the principles. It requires extended analysis of evidence based on an explicit statement of the proposed interpretation and involving the consideration of competing interpretations. Now, if we think, well, how did that play out in reality with Kane? We go to that same piece of evidence and point out that he argues that in particular we have moved from relatively limited criterion-related models, which we saw were the popular ones from the 1920s, to quite sophisticated construct models. But what are they and where are they? I haven't seen them. Have you seen them? I think that's one of our problems. So we have to know, well, what's Kane's answer? Where are they? How can they be validated? Well, we just have to look to Kane's own writing to see that he tells us we have a large number of methods available to answer specific questions about test scores. All of those are related to measurement. So essentially, even the argument-based approach, when the person who created it, and it is a very good approach, I believe, and I believe it's misinterpreted by this very concept of looking only at the measurement, and it doesn't do itself justice, because it is an exceptionally good idea and a way of putting an argument together. However, if you're only putting the argument from one perspective, you're limiting what you can say, and you're actually limiting the value of the validation work that you've done. And I think that's the bottom line that we have to accept. In this quote, all assessments require evidence of the reasonableness of the proposed interpretation, as test data in education have little or no intrinsic meaning. Now, that comes from a medical education journal from Downing 2003. And I think the interesting thing about this is that Kane wouldn't disagree with that. In fact, I would say Kane could have written that. I think it's perfectly sensible. However, we have seen that the tradition that he's representing, the tradition he's come from, is built around measurement. And that argument tends to push a primarily measurement focus. And that's the issue that we have. That's the issue that I have with validation. The headline for this is language testing equals validation. When Cyril and myself wrote a chapter for a book that I had in 2011, that was the title of our chapter, Language Testing Equals Validation. However, the series editor decided that, well, this can't be right. So he changed it, didn't tell us. The book was published and the title came out, Language Testing and Validation. That's not what we meant. In fact, it actually showed that he really didn't get it. He didn't understand the main point of our paper. And the main point of that paper was that every decision we make in the process of test development contributes to the validity of the test. And I'll add this bit in context. So how test performance should be interpreted and what decisions should be made based on those interpretations are among these decisions. So essentially, whatever way we look at the test, whether we're looking at it from a theoretical perspective, or whether we're looking at it from a practical perspective, any decision we make along the process contributes to the validity of the test in context and to the validation argument. So the documentation of what we do and how we develop the test and how and why we make all the decisions we make as we're developing the test are massively relevant to the validity and the validity argument that we put together. And very quickly, we'll have a look at the focus on the stakeholder. And again, we come back to this whole point that if we don't include the stakeholder in our argument, if we don't think about the stakeholder, not just in our arguments, but in the development. Remember, if we're thinking of language testing equals validation, so test development equals validation, essentially. If we don't consider the context, and the context is defined, as I've always argued, by the people who make up that context. Those are the stakeholders. If we don't take them into account from the beginning, so right from the start of the development process, when we're thinking about doing this, when we're thinking about introducing a new national test, for example, we have to go to them and we have to talk to them. We have to understand what how that issue is going to impact on the stakeholders. That is the beginning of the process. So we can say that communication, when conceptualizing the test in context, we should take all elements of the context into account. That means essentially all of the stakeholders and the issues that may arise. Obviously, key stakeholders, we can't please everybody, it's impossible. So we're looking at key stakeholders. We require open and honest communication. That communication should happen pre, during, and after the development process. That is right into the administration phase and should continue as long as that test is administered. The validation argument represents the post-development phase of the communication, but it's built on evidence that you gather throughout the whole development and administration process. So you're constantly getting that evidence together. And the evidence might, the argument, or whatever you want to call it now, may take the form of a short annual report for people to show how well that test is doing in a language that they can understand, of course. So let's get to a few conclusions. Can a test be fair? Well, we agreed at the beginning that the answer is yes when seen as a fairness in context. Well, you might not have agreed, but I think I agreed. I decided right from the start, we can't say that a test can be fair or a test can be valid, but in context is the critical bit. So a test can be fair in context. But where does fair fit? As far as I'm concerned, fair is part of the development and evaluation process and therefore is part of validity. That's it, bottom line. So fairness and validity are essentially the same thing. Can a test be valid? Again, if we think of it as context agnostic, and quite a few tests are context agnostic, it can't be valid. It's impossible. I don't see how you can make, well, maybe not impossible. Like you could win the lottery, for example, but you're not guaranteed to win it when you buy a ticket. So if we take a broader view of validity and validation suggested here, then the test in context can be valid. So I should probably have changed my title to Can Tests in Context Be Fair and Valid? And in this case, the answer is probably yes. Has theory developed? Has validation theory helped? Well, the re-emergence of language theory agnostic or light tests suggests that they haven't, that they've failed to result in meaningful change. They've failed in terms of inclusivity. They've failed in terms of fairness. They've failed in terms of validity, the reality of validity. We're left with a few questions. The first question, is validity an intellectual mind game? A part of me thinks that it has degenerated into a mind game. It's something that academics argue about and nobody else cares about. And if it isn't, it's very close to being in danger of becoming so. Is it time to reimagine the concept? I think it is. I think we have to start again. Maybe not start again. That's probably a bit too much. But we do have to start. We have to go back and ask ourselves, what do we want? What do we want to say? Who do we want to say it to? And how should we be saying it? The final question is validity a myth? How many tests out there actually bother? Not so many, I'm afraid. So the reality of our life is that, well, there may not be any such thing as validity. It might be like the little fairies. It's out there. We'd like it to be there. Some people write about it. Lots of people talk about it, but nobody does it. Thank you. I think we might have a couple of minutes for questions.
Thank you, Barry. It just takes a minute or two for my camera to come on. Thank you very much. That has really given us food for thought. It's challenged us, I think, and we do have a moment or two for questions. I think there's somebody in the audience to bring up on screen. There's a hand. Stage manager to bring. Yeah. That's Nick.
Morning, Barry. Can you hear me?
I can, Nick. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for that very clear and insightful talk. How would you relate what you've said to the talk I made at the beginning, which is if we're looking for it to be different, in what way might it be, and in what way could we work together to make it better? What advice do you give the ALTE membership in light of your comments?
I think the obvious answer, and a lot of what you had to say in your talk, but we come from a very similar tradition, I guess, I think would support what I'm saying here. I think the advice for me is communication. I think one of the things that we're missing, I think ALTE has been very good over the years at changing the way testing is done across Europe and making it more systematic and bringing more of a focus on language back into the test, whilst pushing a measurement approach as well. And the combination of those two has improved testing, I think, across Europe dramatically. I think where we need to go next is to start asking the difficult questions about the interpretations of our tests and the uses of our tests, and about how we can manage to communicate those to the key stakeholders. One of the key areas that we're talking about, and I'm sure Bart later will talk about it, is the testing of language for migration. And that's a huge gap in terms of validation. There was a fascinating LAMI workshop the other day about where we looked at this jagged profile idea, which is, for me, the way it was presented there, it's so blindingly obvious that we should be talking to people and allowing people the space to know and understand that a jagged profile is fine. It's not a problem. In fact, it's probably ideal in migration testing that we're looking at a jagged profile. So communication is the next big thing, I think. How can we take what we already do reasonably well, or to very well, and communicate that in ways that make sense to the people, the migrants themselves, the people who are teaching them, the people who are making the decisions, the policymakers. We need to communicate with them. They need to start listening. This concept of, like, in some countries, Denmark, I think, is like B2. That's crazy stuff. No migrant is ever going to need that. Let's face it, across all the 4 skills. Even if you want to have a fairly strict policy, go for that with speaking maybe, or listening maybe. But writing, you just don't need it. Let's be real. So
Barry, I'm going to have to stop you there, just because we're running out of time. It's wonderful discussion. We could talk about this all day. There are so many exciting strands to pick up on. I've been reading the chat, excellent comments there and really good questions. I'm so sorry we have run out of time for those, but maybe, Barry, if you could have a look at those comments and either go and see those people, or those people can come and see you, or respond in the chat. Please, let's keep that communication going. It's just a shame. Very much for your talk. Oh, have I gone? I'm still there. Yeah, Barry, I'd like to thank you very much for your talk. And we've got to move on now to the next sessions in our program. So you've got a choice of 2 workshops, standard setting in the COVID world in room 1, or what challenges might there be for language assessment in the 2020s in